The sale of alcohol was a big moneymaker for you, but it also provided part of the logistical problem
Yes.
year after year. Tell us about that.
Because of where when we were on public property owned by the city of Columbus, it was always an issue because you have to get council's approval for selling alcohol, and we could never get that. And so we had to work out various logistic arrangements for putting the actual sale of alcohol in the street or in non-city owned property. That was a big issue. It was always a big issue with the school board too, although they would waive it for a number of years. Liability issues and everything else concerned them, so we carried extraordinary sums of insurance and the costs therein related, all because of the alcohol. But Oktoberfest made its money in two ways. One was ticket sales and the other was alcohol sales, and so it is vital to the success of Oktoberfest to be able to sell beer.
My understanding is that Oktoberfest made some years a great deal of money for the society, but there was always an attendant amount of risk involved in it that made it kind of a dicey proposition at times.
Dicey proposition. We thought we had done the best things possible, and looking at when there was the least amount of rain, that an outdoor event like the Oktoberfest is governed by the elements, and if it would rain just one day of the 3 days we would have the Oktoberfest, it hurt us badly. Or even the threat of rain. And then the other thing was when there was an away OSU football game. We tried to organize the Oktoberfest around OSU's home games because that gave us a set-in crowd. As soon as the game was over, we brought people down to the Oktoberfest. So, and with the erratic football scheduling that started to go on in the early 2000s with some away games in September, we had to move things around that way too.
Oktoberfest that you were able to
In some of the really good years, we'd make as much as 100,000. In some of the bad years, we'd make 40 to 50,000. The problem was every year in budgeting, we would budget as if we were going to make 100,000, and then when we didn't, for the society, it was a scramble then to accommodate the difference. And so we got better at budgeting, but the expectation was always to do more, and so we.
There was a little more staffing at that time, I think you told me, to organize volunteers here at the society.
First 10 years of the Oktoberfest, we hired an outside management company from Cox Concessions to some other folks to put on the event. Then when I became chair of the Oktoberfest, we took the entire management of the Oktoberfest in-house. And that required a year-round staff, which included Aaron Leventhal. We first got Cindy Creedon, was hired by the Oktoberfest. And we brought her in. We had a part-time volunteer coordinator, and we had a secretary clerk that the Oktoberfest paid for. And even with those expenses year-round, we kept making the 100,000. So.
You told me that we've just covered the tip of the iceberg of the things that might arise in the Oktoberfest, things like water problems and noise restrictions and those sorts of things.
And the licensure and everything. As I said, it's building a small city, and so months in advance you had to have your liquor license, you had to have your insurance, you had to get the city to bring water in for the food vendors, you had to have fire protection, you had to have police protection. Some of my favorite folks are the Columbus Police Department. We made relationships with them because we'd hire 30 or 40 over 3 days, 30 or 40 police officers. So there wasn't a police officer in Columbus that I didn't say howdy to.
Wasn't there also some sort of issue about you couldn't stake your tents because of
in one of our locations, the city owned it, and they had just put in a new underground watering system, and as a result, we couldn't stake tents because we didn't know where the stakes were going to go into ground. So we had to reduce the size of all of our tents so that you can use water barrels to hold them down instead of stakes. And that was another new experience that we learned as time went on.
How long did you chair?
I was chair for 10 years. Fred was the chair for 10 years, and I was the chair of 10 years, and then the society got out of the business.
But you've been heavily involved for...
From the very first, because the very first Oktoberfest, I sat in an old barn down in the brewery district with the communications.
Out of those 20 years of involvement, is there a great memory that stands out to you?
A single memory, not so much. I mean, I can tell all kinds of war stories, but they're not as funny if you don't know the people. But knowing the people is what it's all about. It literally was Old Home Week every time. We'd have 1,200 volunteers. We had a couple marriages at the Oktoberfest. We had, I can't tell you the number of people who told me things about children being born as a result of the Oktoberfest. Friendships, people came back. A former secretary of the board moved to Arizona, and she scheduled her annual vacation so she could come back to work the Oktoberfest in trash, of all things. We had so many people every year that came back just to see old friends. But so the people were the best part of the Oktoberfest.
One of the great characters we have in German Village right now is a gentleman by the name of Jerry Glick.
Mr. Glick.
And you had occasion to know Mr. Glick well before ever coming to German Village.
Well before.
Tell us about that.
When I was in the 8th grade at Barrett Junior High School, my English teacher's name was Jerry Glick. Mr. Glick was in his second year of teaching at that time, and the students, I was in Miss Brown's homeroom, and Miss Brown's homeroom was right across the hall from Mr. Glick's homeroom, and there wasn't a student in that school that didn't have Miss Brown married to Mr. Glick during that first year. We thought that was a match made in heaven. And then years later, I come back to German Village, and I am, when I first went on the board, Jerry Glick was the president of the society and chaired the board meetings. And I recognized him right away. But Mr. Glick was a man about the community and had a certain image, and I don't think he recognized me, and it wasn't until months later that we had occasion to talk about it, and I introduced myself to him as a former student, and I think the age difference there was such that I don't think he wanted that generally known. Nowadays, it isn't a problem, but Mr. Glick and I, we continue to be associated because Jerry has not missed a game in Ohio Stadium since 1947. And until 2 years ago, he hosted a tailgate party on campus before every football game that we always used to go to. And now he's not able to do that anymore, and so we make sure Mr. Glick continues his long series of unmissed games at Ohio Stadium. So
that must continue.
It must.
So here you are joining the society board. You told us about that. 1992, thereabouts.
Through the back door, yep.
And your primary task, it sounds like early on, was being involved with Oktoberfest. Were there other things that you did in your early years on the...
My first assignments with the, I went on the board and was involved in a couple other committees, but as I've said, there were so many different committees and so many different activities. And then I became vice president, I think, in the second year to Sharon Steele's presidency. And as vice president, I chaired the administrative committee, which was like the executive committee is today. And then when Sharon did not run after 2 years, I became president.
And that was 2000, thereabouts?
97, 98. It was I had just retired from the prosecuting attorney's office, which is what gave me the time to be able to take the job on.
And we talked about how things were different on the society board as compared to today? Tell us about that.
So many things were different. The most noticeable one that I talk about a lot, even today at board meetings, was the fact that every activity had a fundraising element to it and its own checking account. At one time, we counted 20-some different accounts that were out there, run and operated by the person who was the signature on the checking account. Money from House and Garden went into a general fund that ran things, but if somebody had extra money in a committee or wasn't using all their money, that was never thrown into the pot. And so one of the first things we did was to clean up that whole operation so that we had one mission and one purpose and not single-minded activities with their own resources.
And the board was bigger.
The board was much bigger, and people were associated with different activities. There were appointed members to the board who were, one of the early constitutions saw the German Village Society as an education, supporting education. And so we had a member who supposedly was to have been appointed by the president of the Ohio State University. We had another member in civic relations who was supposed to be appointed by the Chamber of Commerce president, all with specific tasks in mind and to some degree specific people in mind, so that there was a wide range of responsibilities, a board attorney, and other kinds of things like that.